has used participatory workshops to understand the energy hardships experienced by racially disadvantaged residents in East Oxford, which is one of the most unequal places in England. It has also documented what these residents expect of systemic stakeholders like the energy companies and the government to address some of these challenges. So our approach is anchored in our funder access as guiding principles of knowledge co-production, EDI, and environmental sustainability. Our project consists of me, Uttara Narayan, Sarah Higginson. Both of us are at the University of Oxford. Elizabeth Blakelock, who is the inclusion specialist and, as you know, has championed this, especially in the fuel poverty space. And our project partners are Oxford Community Action. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So as part of the effort to further a research agenda in this space, the racial justice continuum was developed as a guiding framework for energy researchers and practitioners to start thinking proactively about racialization. Here, racialization means structural mechanisms that assign a hierarchy of meanings to people's identities, thereby leading to unequal access to services and infrastructures that then eventually disadvantages their well-being. Now, this continuum is quite generously inspired by the gender transformative continuum that has been applied in the gender and development tradition. The first column that you see here, which is titled Racial, identifies research approaches that could perpetuate racialized disadvantages. Some examples such as assuming that people from ethnic minority backgrounds are hard to reach or disengage from the decarbonization agenda could be categorized as racial research. The second category, which is the racially neutral category, is concerned with research assumptions that assume that racial dimensions are not relevant to the research question. However, we need to remember that energy is a socio-technical system, so this recognition makes it increasingly difficult to justify overlooking dimensions of social differences and disadvantage. The next category, racially sensitive research, considers racialization, but in a limited capacity, either as an additive characteristic determined by existing categories around race or ethnicity that the data collects. This is necessary and welcome, but insufficient. Now, the fourth category, racially responsive research, aims to nuance this understanding of social divisions by exploring the dynamics between various characteristics of an energy user that influence their demand and how those could impact their material well-being. Now, as you will see in our findings as well, racialization has started to manifest in newer and complex ways that existing categories around race and ethnicity might not fully account for, and which is why we would like to sort of encourage racially responsive research. And then you see the final category, which wishes to eradicate racial injustice in all forms and tackle it at its root causes. Now, while this is what we must strive for, it requires multiple sort of coalition building tactics and structural transformations. Now, we're presenting this template as a useful starting point for us to start thinking about the racial justice agenda in energy research, but it shouldn't necessarily be interpreted sequentially. When evaluating research against this template, it's important to not be tempted by the language of progress that some narratives of justice could be prone to. And we need to apply this responsibly to avoid epistemic exploitation. So we hope that this framework motivates energy researchers and practitioners to engage in racially responsive energy research, giving space to diverse representation of intersecting energy identities in a non-extractive manner. Project Repair is a small effort in this direction, and we look forward to sharing our lessons from it. On that note, I will now hand this over to our partners, Oxford Community Action, who will share more about their organization and then the emerging findings from the project. Over to Nigel. Thank you.
Many thanks, Uttara. Many thanks. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm hoping to be joined by my colleague Mujid Amidi from Oxford Community Action. He's on his way. He's delayed in a meeting that's just been overextended, but hopefully he will be here to join us for this session. I think as you can see from the slide, Oxford Community Action, very colourful photos. The photos, in a way, sort of give a sense that Oxford Community Action is a grassroots, multi-ethnic community organisation based in Oxford City. We work across Oxford City and across the county as well. We formed in 2020, just before the pandemic, just before the COVID-19 pandemic, and sort of as a prelude to us forming as a grassroots community organisation, we undertook some community participatory research in partnership with Healthwatch Oxfordshire, and that research was looking at the disparities in mortality rates. 11 years difference at the time, this was in 2018, between men living in the least affluent parts of Oxford compared to men living in the more affluent parts of Oxford, so namely North Oxford. So like in 2018, 11-year difference in mortality rates. And now in 2024, across the county, there's a 14-year difference in mortality rates between those living in the least affluent parts of Oxfordshire compared to those living in the more wealthy parts of Oxfordshire. And that kind of contextualizes the research, the repair project, and the issues that we've explored in partnership with Rutara and Sarah Higginson, because the communities that we work with are diverse, multi-ethnic communities. They're racialized communities as well. And they're the communities that are at the sharp end of those health inequalities and health disparities. And I'd just like to sort of like touch on a 2021 piece of community research that we did in partnership with Healthwatch Oxfordshire, which was looking at new and emerging communities' views on well-being in Oxford. And that sort of like, that research, again, is a kind of interesting prelude in terms of like some of the lived experience testimony and insights that came out of that research in relation to this particular research project. So very quickly, what people told us, we did a survey, conducted service focus groups and a survey with 152 people representing Oxford diverse communities. And the answers of people on the survey was that people felt that, you know, having well-being linked to having a secure job, having enough money for your needs, and being able to afford healthy food. And then the survey touched on what causes worry and stress for diverse multi-ethnic people living in Oxford. And what people told us was that worries and stress are caused by pressure of life, money, jobs, and family concerns, the cost of housing and food in Oxford, racism and discrimination, immigration worries, and the impact of COVID all cause stress and anxiety. So that was a research, community participatory research that we presented to the Oxfordshire Health and Wellbeing Board in 2021. And that kind of then takes us into this project in a way, from the Oxford Community Action perspective, on the lived testimony of the participants in this project, the repair project around energy use. So the next slide, please. If we could have the next slide.
It's on its way. Apologies.
Okay.
Not
I forgot. There's a delay. There's a delay with Zoom. And so sort of based on this is sort of like, you know, some of the testimony of the participants that took part in the repair project. And a key theme was having warm space, and having a warm space is seen as a welcoming space. And so what people told us is that, you know, And you'll see from the kind of like the quotes on the slide, and linked to the quotes on the slide, what people were telling us was that hosting people and inviting them into your house is an important aspect of belonging and fostering a sense of community. And the participants observed that hosting people is closely linked to how comfortable you feel in the space you inhabit. And then maybe if we can go to the next slide, please. And sort of people talked about, in terms of the living conditions that people were experiencing, people talked about having mold being a consequence of damp and cold spaces. And many of us on this call, in this session, will be aware of the national conversation that's been undertaken over the last year, and in terms of like the incidence of mold in housing, particularly in sort of like private rented housing. As well. So people in this project, the Repair project, talked very much about the incidence of mold and the consequence of having damp and cold spaces. And they said that this had, the impact was psychological as well as physical, and people feel ashamed to actually host people in such spaces. And these uncomfortable spaces also lead to health challenges such as persistent coughs. And then people talked about extending warmth and staying warm are related, but staying warm has a cost to it. So it has a financial cost as well as a health and well-being cost. So the cost that hinders people from having friends over. So again, in terms of relationships, social relationships underpinning your sense of well-being, your sense of health and well-being. And again, this underscores that the energy crisis exacerbates the cost of living crisis. And then many of our participants are recent immigrants to the country, and they're people from places where they are accustomed to warmer climates. Therefore, their familiarity with heating practices and understanding of how retail energy system works in the UK is slightly different. And so this current slide, looking at emphasizing the theme of cooking being a significant way in which people attempt to manage their energy use. So again, here, sort of like the testimony from the participants was around how food and cooking, the food that you've grown up with. So these are for people that are maybe migrant workers here in the UK. They're part of multi-ethnic diaspora communities in the UK. So they're reflecting on their sense of well-being and living and relationships back home in their native countries compared to the situation that they encounter here in Oxford as diaspora communities, as migrant workers, as international students living here in Oxford. And again, food and cooking that you have grown up with and are familiar with are an important part of your own kind of well-being and your own personal and cultural identity. And the slides speak to the testimony where our participants observed that apart from using energy to stay warm, using energy for cooking was the second commonly discussed dimension of managing energy use in the debates and in the discussion of our workshop participants. And most of the participants associated cooking associated with a strong culture of cooking food from home, from scratch. And again, here, this slide, you see the reference to cooking beans, which, which was explained by one of the participants, that cooking beans are an important ingredient in the participants' cooking practices. But this cooking beans, as we all know, takes a very long time to cook. And therefore, there is anxiety around the bill or running costs or running out of energy while cooking. So there's a financial cost to cooking in the way that you would like to cook in your home residence, in your domestic situation. And again, cooking practices are also restricted by the type of dwelling you live in. So if you're living in a housing of multiple occupations, shared housing, and perhaps it's a privately rented accommodation, there are restrictions placed on you in that space by the private landlord. as to when you can and when you can't use the facilities. So all of that hinders your ability to cook when you want and when you want to. And I think if we can go to the next slide, the international student slide. Thank you. Yeah, and so this slide sort of, as you can see again from the quotes from, and from the testimony of the participants, this is again speaking to this issue of international students and migrant workers, recent immigrants living in shared accommodation, and underlying this situation of the international students and the migrant workers and the immigrants is sort of precarity of housing, precarity in terms of use of energy, precarity in terms of the position in the local labor market. So precarity surrounds the living conditions, and precarity is a key component in terms of issues around domestic energy use. And this comes out of the testimony from our participants. So here you see international students and recent immigrants in shared accommodation are further underrepresented in, the research is telling us that, these participants, international students and migrants, are under-researched in energy research, current energy research. And again, I think, what's very important in terms of the racialization of energy use, domestic energy use, is this link in terms of intersecting inequalities and precarious living conditions. And again, in terms of international students and migrant workers and recent immigrants, these are groups that are under-researched in the field. I've noticed that we've been joined by my colleague Hassan Sabri from our colleague at Oxford Community Action. And Hassan is probably zooming in from Kenya. So it's good to see Hassan on the call. And I don't know if Hassan, do you want to talk, if we go to the next slide, perhaps, and we can talk a bit about democratizing solutions to tackle the crisis. And given that, Hassan, that you're in Kenya, and I'm hoping that maybe in Kenya, sunny, hot Kenya, or parts of Kenya that are sunny and hot, that solar panels are seen as part of the solution to democratizing the energy crisis. Obviously, here in the UK, the energy crisis is linked to the cost of living crisis. But Hassan, do you have any views on this last slide, democratizing solutions to tackle the crisis?
You put it in a spot to me, Nigel. In Kenya, it's definitely yes, because at the moment, it used to be like 10, 15, 20, the people who used to live in around has already know they got sun 24 hours, like they got really hot days, and nobody used solar panel. But now it's becoming popular because now everyone in the house, if they can afford it, they don't depend on the government electric. But what we heard about our program, our research, is to me is something daunting. Like I really never, even though I live Oxford for many, many years, what people was telling us, it's something that no one can put it on it because it's difficult. They're facing, the people are not, and when people talk about cost living, yes, it is. But again, it is happening, this energy things, when people don't even know their rights, how to talk to, what company they're speaking to, if they have an issue, and how did they sort it out, the issues they're facing. And I think this is going to be highlighted, but the solution, I don't know where will come, but it needs all of us and our people to come together and understand the voice are already there, what we're going to do with that research. Because the research is only just very small, but people are talking and people are facing that issue. It's real and within our city.
And then Hassan, I think as well, the quote from the last slide. So the participant, I remember the participant in the session, in the workshop session, saying this, that quote that we can see on the slide there. And I think the person was indicating the need for a collective approach, a kind of common ownership approach. So some kind of commons solution to this situation, and maybe sort of like even going in the direction of say like somebody like Guy Standing that has called for a manifesto for sharing public wealth via having a common solution. So I think the person was kind of flagging up something in that terrain of like a commons approach to democratizing the energy crisis, and perhaps in Oxford, in the Oxford context, maybe some kind of commons approach to community ownership of solar panels. That I think that's what she was kind of indicating. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what they're talking about for that day. And I think it's not only her, but it's a lot of people within the people we talk to. That sense of hope, because they don't know what to do with it. They're facing these problems, and some of them are becoming silent because they don't know what issue, where they can solve this issue they're facing. Then definitely common within our city, something that the community ownership would be the brilliant idea.
And then Hassan, just very quickly, because what we didn't say that Oxford Community Action, in terms of some of the participants that took part in the workshop, in the repair workshop, some of the participants are linked to our social network in terms of our community volunteers, and that when we formed Oxford Community Action in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, Oxford Community Action was formed partly as a mutual aid response to the pandemic, and that mutual aid response was a collective response in terms of our community volunteers coming together to develop a food bank that would cater in a culturally specific way to marginalized migrant worker communities and multi-ethnic communities that weren't accessing the mainstream food bank. And so again, I think there's a link in terms of a call for sort of like mutual aid, collective kind of approaches, solutions to issues that are linked to cost of living crisis, energy crisis, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Hassan and Nigel, for that. And it's good for us to sort of end on that hopeful note of collective action and building it on a spirit of mutual aid. And which is why, as you can see, one of the things is raise our voices. And also, I would like to take this opportunity from our side to tell you how grateful we are for OCA's support in this project. And so very quickly to summarize what Nigel and Hassan just said, as you can see, our participants' lived experience testimonies underscore the stress and anxiety that they have to endure when attempting to use energy for basic activities like staying warm and cooking food. These hardships are caused by systemic failures to bring down energy costs and need more explicit efforts to make the energy system more welcoming to people who have been historically disadvantaged. Our participants' experience of negotiating the housing and energy systems while being on precarious visas as students and migrant workers again bears testimony to the structural nature of these experiences of racialized disadvantage, as Nigel was just mentioning. And so for those of us here as researchers and practitioners working on energy, such research hopefully encourages us to investigate how we can meaningfully strengthen evidence to support this group of energy users who don't normally fall under the radar of what we look at. And now when participants were asked about the word they associate with when thinking of feelings of belonging or feeling at home, comfort was what often came up. And comfort is also an important dimension of well-being, especially within the built environment. So this further underscores the importance of exploring these intersections between racialization and energy use, especially with a strong commitment to housing justice, as we can see that sort of commonly has come up in the experiences of our participants. So now, advancing this research and fostering collective action, as Hassan and Nigel were just mentioning, are some ways of taking the racial justice agenda and energy forward. And more specifically, sharing evidence with, say, the all-party parliamentary groups on fuel poverty and energy efficiency and race and community, and then feeding this into community organizing manifestos on housing justice, such as the Citizens UK Oxford Charter, are some ways ahead that some of us would like to take this forward. And we also hope to report these findings back to our community of research participants over the summer and discuss opportunities to sort of translate this vision of installing community energy into a sort of commons community project. So we hope to keep you all updated about that. I will now hand this over to members of the PRIME project. PRIME is a cross-institutional consortium that aims to characterize, manage, and mitigate online risks experienced by minority ethnic communities when accessing digital services in the areas of housing, health, and energy. So very timely. So over to Gina and Menon. Thank you.
Elizabeth, for inviting me, and Uttara and Sarah, it's very nice to meet you again. I was in a previous seminar, so it's nice to be connected to you again. And Nigel, thank you also for your very insightful presentation. You'll see that our findings overlap very much with your findings. So it's a real pleasure to be here in solidarity with yourselves. So it's, as you can see, it's PRIME projects from 5 universities. It's UK RI project, and Menon and I are representing Menon from Cranfield University and myself as PI from Heriot-Watt University. So Elizabeth, if you could just move to the next slide, please. So also I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of 2 of our colleagues, Sasha Hassan from Heriot-Watt University and Nazmeh Ozkan from Cranfield University, who also contributed to this work. So as Uttara said, we are motivated by a concern that processes of digitalization will make worse existing inequalities in housing and health. So these extensively researched and evidence inequalities. And as you know, energy is, at the time when we started our research, was very much an under-researched area. But we knew then that fuel poverty was well established in these communities, in minoritized ethnic communities compared to ethnic majorities. And we were certain there were other inequalities also that we needed to uncover. And also the concern here was that, like health and housing, processes of digitalization could either replicate existing inequalities, they could worsen them, or that give rise to new forms of inequality. So the key aim was to identify the impacts of processes of digitalization on these 3 areas: energy, housing, and health, which is why I'm so delighted to see you making the connections, between energy and housing, and we will continue in that vein to also flag up some of the issues that we have found which add to your findings. And also our intention is very much to co-design and co-produce in the remaining time that we have on the project. So in the space of time that we have, I will highlight some emerging findings through qualitative analysis of the interviews, which were conducted about 100 individuals from 7 ethnic groups in both England and Scotland, and then hand over to Menon, who will present his work on agent-based modeling based on data from an online survey of 878 respondents from the same ethnic groups, again in England and Scotland, exploring the relationship between types of energy services, levels of concerns, and satisfaction about such services, and residents in different types of accommodation. So you can see the link between energy and housing coming to the fore already. So if we could move to the next slide, Elizabeth. So some key findings from user experiences, and I'll be very brief, so it leaves time, for discussion. Picking up on the point, Nigel, that you made about precarity and about how different inequalities interact with each other. This is very much our findings too, particularly with a certain section of the population. And what we found is, not only because because increasingly services are being digitalized, increasingly we have, so it's very important to take into account the impact of digital poverty and its relationship to fuel poverty. So connection to the internet, for example, if you can't connect to the internet, how do you access digitalized services? How do you complain about a problem? And then access to digital devices as well. And then you have coupled with that varying levels of digital literacy. So of course, with some communities, such as older people, this will come to the fore much more than younger people. Again, also varying levels of proficiency in English. So older people, again, may be disproportionately affected, as well as new arrivals to the country who are still acquiring English. And then combined with all of this is housing insecurity, which, and homelessness. And we know here that, minoritized ethnic communities are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. And we didn't pick up many of them in our survey at all, I think for obvious reasons, because it's an online survey, so it comes with its limitations. But it does highlight that there is a very precarious. There's a group that is very precariously connected to services, if at all, connected to services. So in terms of policy and practice implications, the need for effective community engagement comes to a fore, and the implications of lack of such engagement also, is highlighted when, for example, during the pandemic, when people said their digital devices they knew in Stockport, for instance, were distributed, but they felt that they didn't get access to these devices. And I've heard that said also in Glasgow. Where were they? We heard about them, but we weren't getting them. And then also maybe that perhaps reinforces the importance of access to community hubs. So this is something that came through our workshops in Manchester when we conducted workshops there. One of the ways forward that community organizations and housing associations were saying was the need for more community hubs for people who did not have digital devices. And then taking into account the range of languages that people speak, the need for more linguistically sensitive advice, both housing as well as energy, and both in person as well as online. So much more nuanced strategy for communication. And and I think that's all for that slide. So Elizabeth, if you could go on to the next, that's my last slide from myself. So I'd like to pick out on the last slide in terms of a particular problem which people had, and that was looking for cheaper tariffs. So again, Nigel, and Uttara, it links to the point about people trying to find cheaper tariffs, but again hindered because of the digital aspect to it. So experiences of fear and fraud, fear of fraud and scam online. That kind of put people off from looking online for cheaper energy tariffs, a lack of familiarity with the pricing of tariffs, not knowing how it's calculated, even harder, it would be even harder with language issues, a fear of incurring hidden charges through online changes. So if you change supplier, will it become even worse? A lack of ability to ask questions online because, people felt it was very hard to talk to somebody online. Inability to change provider, completely inability. From homelessness to if you're in the private rented sector, you can't change your provider even if you wanted to. So there's a total lack of agency here. So, and then, and in the private rented sectors where minoritized ethnic communities are disproportionately represented, not all, but certainly some communities. And then that fear of landlords, which you picked up, in your presentation, Nigel, fear of challenging a landlord because you could get evicted. And then again, to add to this, we came to know that there were minority ethnic communities were being denied cheaper tariffs by energy companies because of where they were staying. So you picked up, Nigel, the aspect of living in an area of deprivation, and that again is a high proportion of minoritized ethnic communities live in areas of deprivation, and they're the ones, these people living in these areas are the ones who are being denied the cheaper tariffs, which are meant for them. So there's a great need in terms of better regulation, of what energy companies are doing, monitoring websites to make sure that adequate measures are taken to ensure safety against fraud, that cost is being detailed, that energy supplies are really transparent. And of course, a need also to support people with alternative sources of energy supply, such as solar panels and heat pumps, and these more community-based solutions to the monopoly that's currently out there, by energy suppliers, and also help in the process with the transition to net zero. So I'll hand over now to Menon to pick up on the quantitative aspect of our research, focusing particularly on energy and housing.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to all Gina, Nigel, Clara, and Hassan. I will be talking about the statistical analysis side of the survey results. I will be mainly talking about the energy service usage in terms of accommodation type. Energy service concerns of the accommodation for different types of accommodations. And finally, I will be talking about level of satisfaction for energy services. I will be both using some statistical results, but also I will be using simulations in order to give a better understanding of the subject. Next. Okay. This one is just a statistical representation of the energy service usage for each accommodation type. We can make many conclusions, but statistically reading the graph actually, smart meter users are mainly among the who live with their parents. Okay, that may be because of their technological adaptation and so on. But each one of those should be analyzed for further actually. In terms of bills, homeowners and the private renters are the most concerned concerned part of the population. Okay, let me just state that one. All are those for minority ethnic communities specifically, and that the percentages are for distribution in those population. And in terms of reducing the cost, shared housing residents are the ones more concerned and more interested in using that service. And in terms of financial help, temporary accommodation and whoever undisclosed their status is the most financial seeking ones actually. Previously we talked about simulations of each one, but for each parameter we are actually simulating the population and the effect of every parameter on satisfaction of energy service. And that one is for the accommodation type for effect on energy satisfaction. And to sum up actually, we start from homeless to improve the ownership of the houses. And as a result of that simulation, of course, the home ownership increases, the satisfaction with the service increases. But the most important specific point, from homeless to temporary accommodation, the private rent housing, is making the most difference actually. And if you go from social housing to owning the housing, then the significance of the change decreases significantly. Okay, actually, that's the final. Let me make quick.
Thank you so much, Gina and Manan. And yeah, sorry that we had to cut short, but yeah, thank you for those insights. I think that's a lot for us to reflect on. With this, we'd like to conclude the presentation on furthering the racial justice agenda in energy research. And we request you to take a moment to look at this visual artwork that's been created by an amazing design artist that Elizabeth very kindly commissioned. Thank you for that. Sarah from Bad Bish Design. And this summarizes key observations from Project Repair. If there are any words or phrases from this visual that specifically resonate with you, feel free to share them in the chat. And as we do that, Elizabeth, if you can just go to the next slide. So thank you for sparing your time to participate in this. And here are our details if you'd like to stay in touch with us. And yeah, we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you